It's really amazing to me because you guys here are undergraduate students, and you had a personal relationship with the president of the university, and I was here as a faculty member, and I might talk to the man once a year.
Well, I didn't know you weren't supposed to.
Yeah, well, that's right.
I went to see him quite often. In his office.
But even when we were a student there, though, for my part, I'd see him, and I'd go ask questions to him, and I'd say, I'd like to do this. When we were talking about the E-Club, we had some issues. I never thought about it. I didn't even know the chain of command. I just knew Coach Kidd. I knew Dr. Martin. And, anyone else, and eventually going to get to him anyway.
Arguably the two most important
at the time
on campus.
And that part, yeah. And so that worked out pretty well. And, there were limitations at the time and of what you could do, and they had a lot of rules and regulations and things. And like the women had to sign in at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and they couldn't leave the residence halls, and that's another story. That meant so it was Dr. Martin was just really cool in that sense, and a lot of people didn't say he really. I remember even when I became a professional staff person. I mean, I'd go and have conversations with him and talk, or I'd be at Arlington at lunch. He'd call me aside, and I know when I was director of student activities at the Powell building. And this one story, he'd call me over. He'd go to lunch at Arlington quite a bit. And Arlington was very inexpensive to go, and I'd go there early on. And he'd call me over and say, Skip, and I'm paraphrasing this, but I went by because he went to patrol the campus every night. He'd drive by. There's a lot of extra lights left on, or the lights out in the third spot. And and Chad Middleton was the director of facility services. He might have been there too. So after a while, Dr. Martin always called me over, and I couldn't fix it. I'd have to call Chad. So Dr. Martin would give me his list, and I always added my list to it. What things I needed done in the Powell building too. Dr. Martin might give me 2 or 3 things, but I had 5 or 6 I'd keep in line to give to Chad. And Chad knew he talked to me and knew he did that way.
So as far as he was concerned, they were all Dr. Martin's.
Well, I got busted about 2 years. It was a fun 2 years doing it. But those type of things, and Dr. Martin knew about it and had told him. But he was pretty cool about it. But he was he was really a warm person. But he gave the appearance of being. He's just a big man. He's a big man to begin with, and maybe somewhat intimidating. But at those days, remember, he interviewed every person he hired. They had to go through there. Maybe they weren't interviewed much. They had to go through his office, and to be hired, you walk in. You may not have an interview, but you might say, "How you doing?" and "Where you from?" "Good, you're hired." But
I learned that like 20 years later. That what a warm and friendly man he was. I mean, he took me out campaigning one time with him, but now, Ron, you've got a couple stories about wrestling that involved Dr. Martin.
One thing I wanted to say about Larry Bailey made a statement about President Martin one time. He said he could go from gruff to the softest person instantly, just like that. So I would, when I was Vice President of Student Government, I would go over to his office, or whenever I would go over there, and I would go in there and say, I'd like to see President Martin. And so they would say, he's busy or something. He'd hear me, say, come on back, Ron. So we'd always go back and talk with him. And he was always very favorable to get things done. And one of the things when I was a senior, I was, before that, they dropped the wrestling team after my freshman year. And I went back to see President Martin about that, because that's one of the main reasons I came to Eastern. I went to see him in the spring of '68. And I told him, I said, President Martin, I know we got university status July 1st, 1966. Did you start the wrestling team just to help get the university status, because you dropped it now? He said, I did not drop it. He said, all I did was approve it, and I'll prove it to you. He reached right in his drawer and got the letter out, and there it was, the request to drop the wrestling program. And I said, well, I'm asking you today to please start it back, because that's what I meant, one of the main reasons I came here. He said, I'll do it. So he started it right back that day. I got to wrestle my senior year. Then I was a head wrestling coach for 2 years on a graduate assistantship. But my senior year, Coach Francis, Fred Francis, was the coach in name, because you had to have a faculty member. And then we had a graduate assistant named John Plebisco, and he was a great coach also. But they said, if you win the state AAU, if you win the tri-state AAU, if you win this, I won all those, and I lost one match by 1 point. If you do all this, you can go to the NCAA tournament at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. So I came in on that Monday after winning Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky championship, and the AAU championship. And I saw both of them in the hallway, John Plebisco, Coach Plebisco, and Coach Fred Francis. They said, Ron, we're sorry. We found out it takes 2-week requisition to get the money. I said, I got to leave in the morning. I said, I appreciate the help you guys gave me, but I got to go see President Martin myself. So I went over to see him, and I explained it to him, and he said, well, how much money do you need, Ron? I said, $256. I'll never forget. I said, I don't need anything for food. I don't need, just a plane ticket because they're going to put us up out there. And he said, JC, bring the checkbook in here. So he brought the checkbook in. He said, write Ron a check for $256. He said, Ron, represent us well and have a good time. So then when I was coaching, I needed uniforms. So I'd go over there and see him and say, I need uniforms. And I need pregame meals. And every time he would approve. He said, how much you need for those uniforms? JC, bring the checkbook in here. So he'd do that all the time. That was wonderful. But for an athlete that worked all year long to get in the NCAA tournament, to think a 2-week paperwork is going to keep you from getting in there, that was a terrible thing. So he made things special and he made them happen. And I went back and he said, well, how'd you get that done?
A lot of that was that the approach of Dr. Martin. Dr. Martin was a very fair man, and he's very consistent. But I always know that whenever we went to see Dr. Martin, when Paulie Gorman was there, we always talked loud enough so he would hear us. Because if he hear you, he'd call you in. He would say, "Come on back," and that was a trick too. Say Barbara Adams, you have to speak loud enough. You know, like Dr. Martin here, Dr. Martin in. You make sure you get to Paulie because Barbara's in the front. You get to Paulie's in the second room. Mrs. Gorman was there, and she was a sweetheart. But you'd always talk loud enough where he'd hear you, and you always knew he was in because you could see the window from that side when he's in. You always catch him when he's in. But he'd respond. He's very gentle, kind person. Very much a visionary too.
Well, let's move on a little bit. After you were here, of course, you never really left, either one of you. But Ron, after you graduated in 1969, Skip began a lifelong career at EKU. But you were on the staff here as well for a few years. You've told us a little bit about that. How did that happen?
Well, I was a graduate assistant and head coach for 2 years on the wrestling team. And I was in insurance part-time. And they were wanting me to go full-time into that.
You mean insurance?
Insurance selling to college students. I was actually working for Kentucky Central.
Okay.
And I was doing that part-time while I was in graduate school. And so President Martin decided he wanted me to be the admissions counselor, assistant to Dean Ambrose, when Skip was going to go take the student activities job. So he sent Skip over to talk to me. And I told him, I said, well, I really wanted to coach the wrestling team. So I went over to talk to President Martin, and he said, I want you to take this job. I said, I'd really like to have the wrestling coach job. He said, you'll get the job if we hire somebody full-time. Said that never did happen in 1974 because of Title IX equalization of the sports. They dropped the wrestling team. But it was a wonderful experience doing that, and I went and worked with Dean Ambrose, who was a real nice gentleman, a great experience working there with him for 4 years as his assistant and admissions counselor. So Skip moved out of there, and I moved over to that position.
The way it worked, though, when I went over to Director of Student Activities, Dr. Martin and I talked about it, and he said, why don't you go talk to Ron and see if he's interested in doing that, and tell him I want him to do it. And that was the search committee. I mean, that was the thing. And then
right over by Clay Hall, he waved me down when I was driving
and
through.
talked to him, and he went.
That was the interview.